Good afternoon, everyone. I'm standing up today. Something about standing up seems to make you feel like it's a bit more energetic sometimes. So I thought I would talk to you today about when we have a known psychological kind of traumatic event in the workplace that's known to likely leave people causing, some psychological potential risk, I want to say. And what is it that we can do to intervene early at that stage to actually help people to help themselves? And I've been doing interviews for the last few weeks for my new book. So I have a book coming out in February 2023. Seems like such a long way away, but I know it'll go fast. Called How to Heal a Workplace. So tackling trauma, promoting, no, I want to say, promoting psychological safety and boosting happiness at work. And it's a really good kind of overarching book that has a bit of a look at how do we actually have problems that come up in the workplace, why they develop, and then what are the sorts of things that we can do as people who are concerned for our fellow team members and their mental health, but also having a look at how we manage these things for ourselves. And I've been interviewing a few people who are involved in some of the emergency services sectors, in particular the frontline workers, policing, AMBOs, fireys, all of that, and even some of my contacts are in those defence areas. What I want to say, public safety organisations. And one of the things that we talk about is they're known, right, to develop some psychological distress. They're known to be potential risks for PTSD. What a lot of people don't know is that we can see the same kind of outcomes in other areas of work that are exposed to occupational violence, as an example. And so, if we think about occupational violence, we think about potentially doctors and nurses in emergency services departments, because we, much like ambulance officers, we get people who come in who might be in pain or affected by some illicit substance, and that reduces their inhibitions, and sometimes they lash out. And so there's those kind of industries, and then there's other industries that are, what I want to say, the quiet achievers. So in particular, one of the ones that people don't realize is teaching. So do you believe that our teachers are as at risk of occupational violence in the workplace as a lot of those people in those frontline sort of services? And a lot of people are really surprised to find that workers' compensation claims in teaching are nearly as high. In fact, they're only, I think it's about 8.5% for teachers, whereas it's 9% for all of those emergency services workers. So there are industries that we know that the risk of having a traumatic incident or being exposed to a traumatic incident are much higher than they are in other sort of industry groups. And so when we know that we have people who are more inclined to be exposed to those traumatic incidents, what are the sorts of things that we can do to intervene early and actually help them in a really practical way? At the beginning of 2020, when we had all of the bushfires, I was talking a lot about the broader kind of impact of what we see when we have community-based trauma across multiple people, right? So if we think about bushfires, if we think about the current flooding that we're seeing in Queensland, we've got issues there in northern New South Wales earlier this year. We've got issues there of what we call community-based trauma. Now, community-based trauma, yes, it does have a big impact. And I want to say that those, people who are affected in those areas that have had multiple, floods, for example, just recently, or areas that have been bushfire affected several years in a row, we do start to see that there are issues that build within the community, higher levels of anxiety. Often people will move away. They want to, that's how we relieve our trauma kind of activation all the time, is we go somewhere different that we feel will reduce our risk for actually being exposed to these sorts of things. But it doesn't actually resolve the fear that we have, that's often really excessive fear in response to, a particular potential threat, without the threat ever being realized again. And it's a normal part of what our brain does when we're exposed to a particular kind of experience. And anybody who may have had a car accident, and sorry if this triggers people, but if they may have had a car accident, they can then be very cautious or wary of being in the car at the same sort of situation again. And so what our brain does is when we've got that traumatic experience, we then avoid those situations. And that's when we start to see post-traumatic stress develop. So, I might all of a sudden I go the much longer way to work because it allows me to avoid that particular intersection, as an example. Or if it was a roundabout, that we might then avoid anywhere that we have to deal with roundabouts. And this becomes problematic because the way our brain actually stores the information means that then we avoid that situation rather than exposing ourselves to that situation multiple times after the kind of event, which would help to eliminate, or it helps to what we call extinguish, the same sort of fear activation that we get in the same environment. So in some ways, we don't necessarily help ourselves by maintaining a level of avoidance. So when we've got staff who've been exposed to a traumatic incident, whether that was, if you're in a customer service environment, you have a really, angry and quite, abusive, verbally abusive, whatever, person that you've had to deal with. And then you notice that that staff member kind of doesn't really want to do that frontline talking stuff anymore. It can be quite challenging for you as an employer to work out, well, how do you help them to overcome their fear? Because this is the thing about traumatic experiences. The avoidance comes in because we're afraid that the same thing's going to happen again. And, sometimes if we don't approach it properly, we cause people actually to have a little bit more kind of feeling of hanging on to that feeling, because if they let go of the feeling, then, maybe they'll be forced to do something that they don't really want to do. And humans are complex beings, right? So we have to try and work with a person to help them to reduce the impact of the exposure in the first place, and then assist them if we feel like they've kind of, developed this heightened arousal about a particular thing, and so therefore they're avoiding it. So we'll try and give you an example. In the bushfires, I recommended to a lot of people at the time that when these things happen, and I would say the same thing with floods, that we tend to get on the phone and talk to our friends and tell them the whole story and tell them how bad it was and how difficult it was. And we notice that we're talking to people who were affected, and you'll hear the same story over and over again. Now, if they're sitting down, it doesn't actually help them to resolve that. And I don't know if you've noticed, but sometimes when people are talking about something that they're quite passionate about, they'll pace. They're on their phone and they're kind of, back and forth doing this. It's because our brains actually like this bilateral stimulation actually helps us to reduce our arousal. So in the bushfires, I said to people, try and create little community groups where you get together and you go for that walk and talk. So if you've got a staff member that has had some difficulties, rather than taking them out for coffee and just sitting and chatting about it, walk them around the block and have a chat about it. Don't sit in your office and talk about it. Let them go outside. Let's just do the walk and talk. We're doing a couple of things. We're getting the sun. The other thing is that it'll be easier for them to talk out how they feel about something because they're not being eyeballed by you. So it gives them an opportunity to kind of express their frustration. And one of the things that I want you to try and do in that moment is just hear them, right? Rather than trying to solve the problem for them. Because one of the things that happens when we walk and talk, right, is that we eventually get to the point where we start kind of bringing the arousal down. And then the brain will naturally go into okay. And then you can introduce the problem solving opportunity into that, right? So the walk and talk is something that's really essential. And I want you to kind of think about, if you have two staff members who've had an argument about something and one kind of walks out and leaves the building, what we tend to do is, depending on the circumstances, either somebody runs after them because they're, trying to be the helper in it. But really what you want to try and do is get to the bottom of the situation. You may already know where, there's some tension that's going on and it hadn't been addressed, and then there's a blow up. You want to be able to have a conversation individually, but then you want to facilitate a mediation element as soon as possible. So, yes, I realize you're probably busy with other meetings and other things to do. You don't have time to walk around with the person while they whinge at you. But I want you to think about the fact that it's not about just them whinging. It's actually about them being able to be heard, be validated, feel that at least, even if they might have overreacted to something or done something, but their frustration and their experience is being validated. Because if you can validate their experience, then they're more likely to try and work with you in trying to do something to overcome it and move them forward, if that makes sense. So, in much the same way as if they've been exposed to something that, if you were in an emergency services department and somebody was assaulted, sure, you're in the hospital, right? You can deal with it straight away. But being able to take that person after the wound's been sorted out or whatever, but just take them on a bit of a walk around outside, preferably, if you can, and, just kind of get them to debrief about their story while you're actually walking around, because the bilateral stimulation within our body naturally helps our nervous system to actually calm down. And I've been doing some stuff. I was approached to comment on an article in Reader's Digest last week it's not been published yet, but it was for a Reader's Digest article, and I was talking to them last week about a thing called traumatic release exercise. And so I did some work around it and found it quite interesting, and it made sense to my brain about why our physical sort of central nervous system and our autonomic nervous system response to the stress of the trauma is something that we can actually do things with our physical body that allow us to kind of bring that arousal right down. One of the things that happens when we're exposed to a traumatic event is we tend to kind of fixate our eyes and stare. And then when we do things like EMDR therapy, that's one of the ways that EMDR works, is that it gets you to think about that event that would normally make your brain go, uh-oh, danger, and focus. And we're moving your eyes contrary to what your brain actually thinks should be happening if this was a real threat. And so that's part of, it's not the only reason, but it is part of why a process like that actually works. And it's part of why things like tapping work. They actually tend to put, you may have heard of tapping for all sorts of different things, but they're tapping on meridian points within the body. So we're actually getting the nervous system reaction in response to something that we're focusing on that would normally create an arousal, and we're kind of telling the nervous system actually it's okay. And most people find that kind of side to side movement, any form of side to side movement, quite calming, right? So you'll notice I was talking quite passionately, then I do this, doesn't take much, right? And then we kind of calm it down. So it's an interesting element about why we do that bilateral movement, why we need to move side to side, why it helps in our brain, because our brain actually has these two hemispheres, and there's a big bundle of nerve fibers that go in between the two. And when we experience a traumatic event, the best way I describe it to people is it's like you store the information about the what happened on one side of your brain, and the experience of the emotional reaction and all of the sort of passion elements to it on the other side of the brain. At the time that it happens, if we can intervene where you're doing something like walking or talking and both at the same time and moving your body, then you can help yourself to actually resolve through those issues. So trying to remember walking and talking is one of the earliest intervention things that you can do with your people. Because if they're exposed to a traumatic event, what we tend to do is we go, oh, never mind. Okay, just go home. And they go home and they spend all of their time thinking about what happened and how bad it was and how upset they were and all of that. And they may or may not have anybody at home that they can talk to about it, but they also consolidate the information about what the event was and how bad it was. And then they go to sleep. And then when they go to sleep, the memory actually sends it down into the long-term memory store. And we've kind of lost our opportunity to do the best thing that we can for them. If we can intervene immediately after the event, in the first 6 hours ideally, and we just kind of get them to talk about the situation while we're walking, so not the sitting still, but while we're moving the body, then what we do is give their central nervous system an opportunity to actually process through that memory, the information, the stuff that was outside of their control, whatever it was, and come to a rational understanding of, yes, that was a bad situation. These are the things I probably could have done that might help to mean that that wouldn't happen again in the future. and we can then hopefully settle the system down enough so that then when they go to sleep that night, they consolidate that memory, and the next day it's not as negatively impactful. So the biggest issue here is giving people ways to help themselves, giving people ways to get off those negative sort of feelings in a way that's effective or works, and then also making you feel like when this person's kind of in that sort of hyper aroused state, that you don't know what you're supposed to do to help them. So just remember, I talk about raw being recovery at work, being able to stay connected to your community and feel like you're a part of it. But the walking talking thing is a really, really simple thing that actually works really well. All right, I hope that helps. I will see you next week and again the week after, but then I'm having a little sabbatical. I need to write the new book, right? So I'm going to take a couple of months off to do that. I am going to Europe, so it's a little bit of have a holiday, write a book. You all do that, don't you? All right. I hope that helped. And if there's anything that you would like me to talk about in the next couple of weeks, please make sure you post in the comments below, and I will see you soon.